Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mark Skidmore. I'm the director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. Thanks for joining us on this webinar. Today we have Professor Eric Toman from Ohio State University giving the webinar. He's an associate professor and chair of the Graduate Studies Committee in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at the Ohio State University College for Food, Agriculture, and Environmental Sciences. And he is going to be talking about farmer to non-farmer, the role of farmer identity and conservation, which is based on a survey of nearly 4,000 landowners who are residents and looking at the conservation methods and activities that they engage in. So for those of you who are participating, if you have a thought or a question or a comment, please feel free to just type that into the chat, and when Eric gets to it, he can respond to that either along the way or near the end, whichever seems to work out best. So without further ado, Eric, it's all yours, and thanks again.
Wonderful. Thanks for that introduction, Mark. I appreciate it. So I think in typical faculty fashion, I probably have way more material here than we can really cover today. So I will be jumping through a few of the slides a little bit quickly as we move on. Certainly there are things we could refer back to if they come up in questions, or I can send more information out as people are interested. But I'm grateful to be here. I did want to acknowledge the project team. So I'm presenting today, but I wanted to acknowledge Teresa Groth, who was a postdoc with me here at Ohio State, and then Jay Arbuckle, who's at Ohio State University. I've also had help from Maggie Beatstra, who's a current PhD student work with me, who's done quite a bit of work on analysis on this as well. So I wanted to acknowledge everybody for their contributions. And as Mark noted, I also want to acknowledge the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development for the support for this project. So as I mentioned, there's more material here than we're really probably gonna have time to spend a great depth of time on. So again, if there are particular points that you're more interested in, please feel free to note that in the chat. We can come back to them, or at the end, I do have my contact information. I'm more than happy to discuss things with you outside of this presentation as well. So just to sort of set things up, and I don't think this is going to necessarily be news for anyone joining, as this is really sort of the genesis of this project. It's just the substantial amount of change that's occurring in rural communities. So there's a substantial change occurring within these communities, something I expect, again, all of us are probably familiar with. And as I note here, it's complex. It's not happening at the same rates everywhere. There's variable rates. There are some places that are, there's population growth driven by access to high amenity landscapes. There's other places that are close to urban population centers, and so you have exurbanization occurring there. We still have, in some cases, issues of boom and bust, particularly around like fracking and other energy development, and other industries that decline. We may see some more bust again around those. So there's a lot of different things going on, and we're clearly not going to be able to answer all of this today, but part of the genesis for this project and sort of it's within sort of this field of project of research that we're working on, is an attempt to really understand these changes that are occurring and what that really means for land management within these regions, whether it's in agricultural areas like we're presenting here today. We have some work in some forested communities and mixed communities as well. And so we'll be talking a bit about these things today, particularly in the locations that we're working in. So ultimately our goals today, these were the project objectives: develop a better understanding of rural populations. And one of the themes within this work, or the efforts within this work, was to work on a new tool and try to measure the effectiveness of this tool that's meant to identify or measure the identity of rural landowners. And I'll describe that a bit more as we go on. And then the second point here, examine the influence of variables such as identity and these other variables on farm management practices. And we'll get into that a little bit today, but not as much as some of these other questions, but so we'll focus primarily on the first point here today. This is one that I figure I can move through fairly quickly. I will be talking about these components later, and so felt like I needed to at least include a definition here. But I'll just highlight them fairly quickly. Each of these does have a foundation in the literature, but this is ultimately how we're sort of thinking about and defining these points. The few that I might point out are the first two. I think it's pretty common when we look at decision making, whether it's around agricultural decision making or other decision making, that we often talk about things like values, beliefs, norms, and attitudes. So those are really common. Knowledge, I think, is another one that would be fairly straightforward. We do distinguish in our work between a couple of different types of values, these held values and assigned values. So held values are more what many of us may think of when we think of values, these sort of guiding abstract principles that guide our sort of decisions and life choices. Assigned values are maybe they're more specific and they're attached to specific goods, and this is I'll present a little bit later about assigned values. And then this bottom factor of identity, and this is something I'll define a bit more here on this next slide. But I think the rest of them hopefully are fairly straightforward. But again, we can come back and define these a bit better if we need to as we move on. In this slide, we're really talking about different ways. There's been different efforts to classify rural landowners. So to think about who's living in these rural landscapes and what that means for how we might engage with them, to if our goal is to encourage certain land management practices, or if we want to understand what their information needs might be, how we might be able to identify and classify them in order to engage more effectively with them. Much of the prior work has really focused on within the agricultural landscapes, at least on the farmer population themselves. And this may miss important information about really this diversity of landowners we're now seeing on the landscape. So we may have these non-operator landowners that may not be involved in agricultural decision making, even though that those decisions are happening on their property. Some prior research does suggest that these owners are highly interested in conservation, but they may not be as engaged in some of the management decision making. But regardless, ultimately, I think what this points to is this diversifying and complex population, and part of our goal is to help think through how we might be able to better understand that population, to think about how we may engage with them. I mentioned I would define identity a bit more. There's a lot of information here on this slide, and I apologize for that. But the main point, so looking at the top, the first bullet of identity, and then ultimately it's this self-concept. It's how we view ourselves, how we envision ourselves, what we think is important about who we are, and how that ultimately influences our decisions. It's likely that, as we think of different identities that we might hold, that if we can identify groups that hold similar identities, that they're likely linked to a fairly consistent set of values, beliefs, attitudes, and norms. Not everything certainly will be identical, but they can provide some ways of helping us understand and classifying our populations based on these identities. Within what we'll be talking about today, we'll really be focusing on this occupational identity. So under the second point, there's quite a bit of work on identity, and it comes out of different literature areas that they don't necessarily all speak to each other either. And so I think there's some interesting work even trying to understand conceptually how these different literature areas fit together. Occupational identity really looks at this, and so the main point I want to draw today is thinking about the individual sense of identity and who they are can be really closely tied to occupation. And this is particularly the case for some professions that are considered more than a job, but really sort of as a way of life. And I think we can think of agricultural decision making and agricultural operators as sort of falling into this category, where being a farmer is more than just bringing home a paycheck. There was some work in the 80s and 90s looking at logging communities in much the same way, and I think that this potentially provides a link into particularly some of these natural resource and more traditional maybe economies in rural areas of helping understand these communities. So there's been some work more recently, really led by Teresa Groth, who, as I noted at the beginning, was a postdoc operating on this project, trying to develop this farmer collective occupational identity construct, the final bullet here. And so I'll introduce that a little bit here, but really the idea, again, was to try to develop a construct that can help us as we try to understand our rural populations better. So there's two slides here in a row on occupational identity and on this construct. The main thing to take here is ultimately, so Teresa did her, she's from Michigan originally, but did her doctoral studies down in Australia in a university where I have an adjunct appointment. And she, through this work, began to develop this farmer collective identity construct. And she did some interviews and qualitative work both in Australia and here in Ohio to begin to test the tool out, and then conducted a survey in Australia where she then was able to assess the reliability and validity of this tool. And it proved to be an effective and reliable tool in the Australian context. And so this study was the first time this tool was applied in the US in a survey. What I show on the right are just ultimately that this is envisioned, this construct is envisioned as including these, here we go, these 6 different dimensions that are noted over here. And so there are items that attempt to measure each of these dimensions. So this is a bit more definition about these dimensions. This is, again, something I think I'll move over a little bit quickly today. But again, something we can come back to, or I can point you to some resources with some more detail about what these are. But essentially, there's items within the survey that attempt to measure each of these components. And one of our goals was to see if the scale held together as well within our population. And then consider whether or not it was a useful tool at helping us better understand our population. All right, so just to quickly describe sort of our methods and what we did. We conducted a mail survey in 4 different counties, 2 in Ohio and 2 in Iowa. Paulding and Henry in Ohio, and Wright and Pocahontas in Iowa. The survey went out a year ago. It was ongoing. As Mark noted, we had 4,000 landowners, and we limited our sample to landowners with more than 40 acres with the attempt to limit out people who owned small properties that had no agricultural operations ongoing on them. We wanted a bit larger properties. We had a 26% response rate and ended up with just under 1,000 participants. Down here, I note a number of measures that are included, and as I noted here, we're not, or have described before, we're not unfortunately going to be able to get to all these today. There's a lot in this data set, and I think a lot of really good, valuable information that we'll be able to draw on to answer a number of questions as we roll forward. Today, we'll talk quite a bit about the different ways of classifying landowners and some different methods we had embedded in here to do that. And then in some ways, we'll look at how the population may differ depending on the different classification tool we use. We'll look at things like values and beliefs, as well as demographic items, and look at how our populations differ depending on how we classify them. Just quickly to point out sort of where our counties were located. So northern Ohio and sort of northwest Ohio, and sort of north central northwest Iowa as well. All right. So as I mentioned, we'll really focus on these different methods to classify our rural landowners. Looking at the self-categorization, so we included a question asking participants to identify themselves and categorize themselves as, and I'll note what they are, as farmers, non-farmers, or part-time farmers. And this is part of, or it's a way for us to provide a check on our the farmer collective identity construct scale as well. We'll also look at these non-operator landowners and compare them to operators of different types, and then ultimately identity. And this is really looking at the FCOIC scale, and then we'll talk a little bit about what our results might show. These next few slides have more detail than we might be able to draw on. These first few are looking specifically at, again, the self-categorization. So a few things I want to point out as we begin here. So whether or not people were classified as a non-farmer, as a part-time farmer, or as full-time farmers, that was a self-declaration. So there was one question where they were essentially given these prescribed categories, and they identified the one that best fit their particular role. And so I wanted to highlight that, and then also note here really the large difference in the numbers between these categories. So in these largely agricultural communities or counties, and again, at ownership over 40 acres, the largest category considers themselves non-farmers, which I think is fairly significant. Part-time farmers was less, so 171, and then a bit more than that, full-time farmers, but still not even half of what we see in terms of the non-farmers. And here we begin to see some of the differences between these types of populations. So I will note, so I've got where there are significant differences between groups, I note them with the asterisks. Here, in this case, I used a couple of different tests just because of the type of variables we were looking at. So on this slide, if it has one asterisk, then it was significantly different based on a Kruskal-Wallis comparison, and 2 or a chi-square. But essentially, they're just looking at differences between the overall distribution of responses in both cases. So ultimately, our non-farmers appear to be older, so they were significantly different on that. Much more likely to be retired, particularly as we compare to full-time farmers, as well as much more likely to be female. We also see differences in terms of the total acres that are owned, with full-time farmers in particular having a much larger amount of ownership. And then these bottom points, so again, sort of thinking of these communities, we particularly targeted these counties because of the high rental rates, which we can talk a bit more about later. But that was ultimately one of our goals, was to assess some of the differences in how landlords and tenants may view farm management and decision making. And so we have a number of items focused on those points. But as you can see, looking across these different systems, so full-time farmers, this is the median acres that full-time farmers tended to rent in. So this is lands that they were operating on that they didn't own, but were paying a rental fee on. Whereas among non-farmers, this is the amount of land they were more likely to rent out. So the median acreage was 125 acres rented out by the non-farmers, and less, but still renting out a positive number among part-time farmers, whereas full-time farmers were unlikely to be renting out land, at least at the median level. So this is looking at adoption of different management practices among these, again, looking across these 2 different groups. Here again, we see significant differences on each of these items. And in general, full-time farmers were more likely to adopt these practices. In some cases, like we see here with minimum or no-till, part-time farmers indicated a higher adoption, or were more likely to adopt than full-time farmers, but still a substantial number of each of those. And so again, in each case, full-time farmers were more likely to adopt these practices than others. I think also, as I note here on the bottom, not necessarily super visibly, but just wanted to raise that what we're showing here are the number who indicated that they had adopted these practices. Also, non-farmers were much more likely to indicate that they didn't know. So this is the numbers that are in this column are from those who indicated if they knew if this practice had been adopted on their property. But in each case, many of them were more likely, they were more likely to indicate that they didn't know. And in some cases, that number was quite high, indicating a sort of lack of familiarity of the practices ongoing on their property. I think there could be some interesting conversations about, even these specific practices, but we'll kind of skip over them a bit today, just to move on, given the time we have. So this is really getting at this idea of the sort of the assigned value. So what are the motivations for owning land? And on this, I think the few things to sort of point out, I mean, ultimately that they were pretty high across the board as we go through these first 4 items across all non-part-time and full-time farmers. The land seems to be a more important source of annual income, or that seems to be a higher attached value for full-time farmers than it is for part-time and non-farmers. I think also interesting looking at the responses to this item of all or part of the land has been passed down through generations. Full-time or non-farmers, were more likely to indicate that was the case. And this does match literature that shows that many of these non-farmers that own land in other locations too, but studies are finding that are more likely to have come into the land via inheritance. Interestingly, I think to pointing out the idea earlier that some prior research has shown that non-farmers or non-operated landowners often have conservation values and that they may apply to their lands. Here we actually see the non-farmers rate this ability to pass on a healthier environment for future generations lower than both part-time and full-time farmers. Also, I think interesting, and this is particularly compared to some other locations, these bottom two items of valuing the property as a place to view wildlife or a place for recreation were both below the midpoint, indicating that these weren't really that important to most of our respondents, which again is quite different in other locations. I mentioned before the idea about high amenity landscapes in particular, and so those might be places where you would see these values being quite a bit higher. So it points out some of this differentiation we see between locations. All right, with beliefs, I think that some of the main things to point out here, there was pretty consistent beliefs on some of these items. So the idea about being concerned about agricultural impacts on water quality at the state level was pretty consistent across these groups. There was some differentiation, though, on a couple of items here. So non-farmers were more likely to indicate that nutrients from ag fields contribute to water quality issues, again, within their own state. Although this is still a majority agreeing, or on the positive side of agreement here. Full-time farmers were more likely to indicate that, and part-time farmers as well, but that farm practices, nutrient management practices they were already engaged in on their own property are sufficient to protect local water quality. Non-farmers were less likely, but again, still high, still relatively high agreement on this scale. And this is the only thing I think that we saw within the data set, and I've like triple checked this because it seemed odd, but they came out as equivalent means across the board on, and this would be right around, so again, on a 1 to 5 scale with the 2.5 being sort of the neutral midpoint, just above the neutral midpoint. So really right around the middle, saying farming activities on my farm don't make much difference to overall water quality. So generally, I would say it's interesting, I think, that people fall out likely on this. Norms, I think maybe not much to talk about here other than to note again how similar these are. And I think both of these really sort of focus on the idea of engaging in conservation management practices or thinking about environmental impacts when looking at making property management decisions. And so there were no significant differences here. And ultimately, relatively strong agreement with these, which I think is pretty interesting. I think indicating that the importance of environmental factors when making farm management decisions, and agreement across from non-farmers to full-time farmers here. Okay, so this is now switching to another way maybe of thinking about how to classify rural landowners. And on these next few, we're really just going to look at differentiation between some different demographic variables. But this first slide is showing a way that we might be able to, another way we might be able to classify rural landowners. And so we had a bank of questions at the beginning of our survey that asked participants to indicate how many acres they owned, how many they rented out, how many acres they also rented in. And so we developed this response based on this chart here based on responses to those items. And I think it's pretty fascinating, a few things that stick out here. So one, nearly half, so 45% of our respondents rented out all of their land. So these would be the non-operated landowners. So nearly half of our participants rented out all of their land, which is, I think, pretty fascinating. And then those who rented in land and only rented in land, so didn't own any land, but were at least that they were engaged in agricultural operations on, but they rented in all their ag land, was nearly a quarter of our population. For our what we're calling 4% were operator landlords. This is maybe a bit confusing. These are people that both rented land out and rented land in, and then 30%. Just they owned land and they operated on that land. So this 29% are people who didn't rent land in or out, but were engaged in agricultural management practices on their property. Oops, dragging that around. The note here, just to highlight that then, so these tenants only, so people who only rented land in, as well as these operator landlords, a smaller percentage, but this shows that over a quarter of our population were tenants on some portion of their property. And this again gets at, I think, what might be some key questions about how we engage these tenants in questions around conservation management. That may involve investment and long-term sort of investment in property when they're tenants and not necessarily having long-term ownership of that property. Again, these are just looking at now thinking of these non-operated landowners and the farmer operators specifically, and thinking about how we might distinguish them. So this is here looking at gender. Again, we see a large differentiation between the two, where these are significantly different. I've noted them up here in just a slide header. So our non-operated landowners are much more likely to be female. The farmer operator are much more likely to be male in the sample. Formal education, we again begin to see some of these differences. So those that have a bachelor's degree or higher, non-operated landowners were much more likely. So a majority, just over 50% of them, had a graduate degree or higher, and no bachelor's degree. So this would be high school education or some college, but not culminating in a bachelor's degree. Again, we see differentiation with 2/3 of farmer operators indicating that represents their formal education status. Retired, similar to what we saw earlier in the other classification scheme, but I think maybe more dramatic here, our non-operated landowners are much more likely to be retired. I think pointing at maybe some of the reasons that they're non-operators currently, maybe from an age perspective. Although even among our farmer operators, we still certainly had, there was still a majority that were not retired, but it is pretty close to 50% that indicated that they were retired as well. These next couple of slides I think are fairly interesting too. We had questions about where people grew up and where they live now. And with these, so this was not significantly different, although you can see maybe some apparent differences here, but not significant differences because of the variation. That people, the majority of people grew up in either rural unincorporated or small towns, very few in suburban or cities. But this is where we also asked where they live now, and this was significantly different. And here I think what we see is among our non-operated landowners, so here in blue, they're more likely to live in city or suburban areas and even small towns, and much less likely to be in these rural unincorporated areas than we have among the farmer operators. And we also asked if people ever consider themselves to be a farmer, and perhaps isn't surprising, but again, this is one of the questions that may relate to identity. Among our non-operator landowners, we had half of them consider themselves to be a farmer at some point, whereas our farmer operators, 3/4 of them indicated that they consider themselves to be a farmer. So given time, and I'm not going to spend much time looking at the COI-C scale. I just wanted to note, ultimately, part of our goal was, again, to test the effectiveness of this scale at helping measure identity. And so this would be the third way of that we're looking at here anyway, of potentially classifying landowners. There's a lot of detail here that I feel like we have to show in order, because we're essentially testing the reliability of the scale and the validity of it. Ultimately, we went through a process to do that. We did have to reduce our number of items. So I mentioned before at the beginning that we had these 6 dimensions and we had multiple items for each. As we went through this process, we ended up reducing that down to 9 items. In doing that, it did show that it was a reliable scale, and ultimately it was effective at producing, at identifying, classifying our participants across those, and it seemed to, and we did test it across those self-declared landowner types as well. So it did seem to work from that perspective. And I think one of the interesting things that it shows, and this is different than what was found in Teresa's work in Australia, that ultimately we found sort of really just 2 groups. And I think as we saw some of the questions earlier, we could maybe see some of these breaking out, but where we have people that we may think of very differently, but ultimately they're identifying as either farmers or non-farmers. So even the part-time farmers, for the most part, identified themselves as farmers from an identity perspective. And so when they view themselves and sort of the community with whom they interact and associate, they tended to see themselves as farmers and identify with the farming community. In this case, there were, as I mentioned, we had 9 items in the scale. So by creating the scale, participants could receive a total score of 45 on the scale. And farmers were scored a 37.92, and the non-farmers, these are essentially the 2 groups that came out of there. There were these 2 distinct groups. They loaded around 25.52, and so we have different scores, different average scores across these 2 groups. And again, within the farmers, this is where we ended up having most of the farmers and the non-farmers both sort of identifying, we had the farmers and the part-time farmers both identifying as farmers. So ultimately, they share a common identity, despite sort of the occupational differences in how they may operate. Ultimately, I think the takeaways from this at this point, again, pointing to this idea of the complexity of rural landowners, that the population within these rural communities, and even communities that may not, again, have necessarily high amenity values or be ex-urban, and so may not be experiencing the growth of urban areas, we're still seeing large-scale differentiation within these communities. And again, I'm not sure that would be that. I'm sure this is something that many of you are familiar with. And I think within that, just even noting the changes within these populations, that nearly half of our participants in our case rented out all of their property. This idea of thinking about how to distinguish these different population groups, I think as we look forward into thinking about the expectations and sort of demands that may be placed on rural lands, as well as ways that we may seek to engage these populations to adopt different conservation management practices, that'll be really key to understand these different population groups, the groups that may exist within these rural communities and how they're shifting. And I think what we see here was, looking at these, even just embedded within this one survey, we could break out these different ways of looking at these populations. So these 3 different approaches. And I think all of them have some value and can help provide insight into better understanding our current rural populations. And they can play a role at sort of helping us, maybe drawing on all of them really to help us understand sort of who the population is that we're working with, and how we might want to engage with them. I think it is also sort of notable the number of differences that were evident within our populations. I just note a few here. Ultimately, and probably not surprisingly, that full-time farmers are more likely to be financially reliant on agricultural production. So again, when we think about how to engage these populations, the idea of thinking about how suggested practices may impact the bottom line, while influential for all, will probably be more influential on full-time farmers. These non-operator landowners differ from farmer operators in a number of ways, and both through gender, they're more likely to be female, more likely to have more formal education, more likely to be retired, also more likely to live in suburban or urban areas. And this idea of part-time farmers identifying as farmers. And again, this is something we've seen differently in different communities. But again, as we're thinking of ways that we might be able to classify and consider these populations, I think these tools can help us recognize, ultimately, again, as we're thinking about how to engage with these different groups, that many of the tools we might use to engage with full-time farmers, some of those will apply to part-time farmers as well, particularly when it comes to these questions that focus on identity. And I think this last point, I will note here, this should say may instead of many. I just noticed that as I was speaking here. So thoughts about how may influence efforts to engage landowners. I think this is something that I think bears some consideration. Ultimately, that as we seek to engage landowners through extension or through whatever efforts we may be in, that we recognize that the population is not uniform, and that we ultimately, this points to the need to tailor our approach to the communities that we're working with. And to do that, we need to better understand those communities, obviously, what their needs are, and how we may be able to engage with them more effectively. Okay, I am now realizing that I've missed a couple of these questions, or a couple points that we can look back on here. But with that, I wanted to again say thank you for your time. I know I rushed through some of this. I apologize for needing to move through it so quickly. But again, if you've got further questions or would like to discuss some points more or follow up with some of these items, please feel free to send me an email and I can send you information. Or if you put your email in the chat box, I can note it as well and send information to you. So looking back at comments, so Rebecca asked if, and sorry, Mark, I don't know if this was something you want to facilitate or if I can just look at those.
Oh, no, please go ahead. I was going to suggest that we look at them, but you beat me to it. So yes, thanks, Eric. Go ahead.
Okay. And others, I guess, feel free to submit questions too. But Rebecca asked, when looking at non-farmers, did age, gender, and acres seem to be associated with surviving spouses? I think that actually, that's a great question. And it's not something that we've yet looked at just because we haven't got to that part of the data yet. But I'll note that. And Rebecca, I'd be more than happy to follow up with you afterwards. I think in many cases that likely is true. I know we've definitely seen that in other locations. So thinking the idea of inheritance of land, it can be surviving spouses. And I think there's some evidence that might be the case here when we see the age of our participants. In some cases, it may be surviving family members as well. So moving down to children, but in those cases, I think, again, we would see the overall age come down. So I think on average, what your note is probably not abnormal. But I'm not sure that that's the only thing going on. So I'd want to look a little bit more into this if we've got enough data to demonstrate that, or if people may be, again, retiring and moving into some of these landscapes. In some of the locations we've worked, that's definitely been the case where there's been an influx or in-migration to these communities of non-operator landowners as they've retired from a career in more of an urban setting. Oh, Bill, I'm sorry I missed yours as we were going through this. You asked about where operators who owned some land and rented in some land were included on the previous slide. Here we go. I think you were probably referring to this slide. So people who rented land, let's see, operators who owned some and rented in some land. So people who rented in land, so they owned land and rented in land. Sorry, just repeating that to myself. Yeah, I agree with the way we've sort of defined this. That isn't entirely clear. They're lumped into this group of the 29%. So these people rented in land. So yeah, even with our classification over here, I'm just looking at that. There were substantially fewer that rented in land than land out. So I think as we were defining these, we didn't specify that very clearly. But those who rented in land, some of them rented in a substantial amount of land, and so they would have high amounts of acreages that were rented in. That's a good note to check this, and I can actually, again, if you want to send me a message or even put your name here, I can even follow up with a better differentiation on these. Thanks for asking that. Your next question, one thing that would have been interesting to ask the landowners is, are you concerned about whether the tenant is using conservation practices that protect the future productivity of their land as opposed to just being concerned about downstream water quality? And we do, so I didn't get into, we had a bank of questions that asked more detail about practices being adopted on properties, both by tenants and for those who are renting land. And I am not sure if we included that specific question, but I would agree that you're right. I'm trying to look over at our items real quickly here. But we did ask questions about, let me see, we did ask questions about maintaining soil productivity, avoiding soil erosion runoff. I think the soil productivity is probably the one that gets most at the question you're asking about managing the future productivity of their land. So not one that I presented here, but it is an item that we had within the survey. Okay, another question for the landowners is many tenants would be interested in competing to farm their land if they wanted to find a tenant that does a better job with conservation. Yeah, that's actually a great question. We and I'm not sure. That's an interesting thought too. If that might be sort of a deciding factor in how people may decide about um, who they might choose to rent their land out to. And I think that we had some items that may get at this about how they rank these different priorities when they're looking for. So we asked them to rank the priorities of tenants versus as landlords. Their So landlords' preferences and priorities for tenants. We also asked tenants to rank their priorities for landlords, and conservation was definitely on there. So we can see sort of relatively how well they rank, but we didn't. We didn't get at this the other question really of, if there'd be a way for them to sort of differentiate among their prospective tenants, I guess, to identify those that may do a better job with conservation. Um, I'm trying to think too of other items that might somewhat get at this. We do ask, I think we asked a couple of questions about whether they had clauses in the contracts around conservation and if they felt those were sufficient. So I guess allowing them to switch operators if they felt so inclined. But I think that it is an interesting question. Um, I think one of the areas which we haven't looked at much is really, I think and other work has pointed to the relative sort of limited role that landlords have historically felt like they play in agricultural decision making on their own properties. I think in many cases they have long-term tenants. We haven't been able to dig into that data here yet, what we have on that, but I think those are really important questions as well, that we need to dig into, and look forward really to digging into in some more depth. So I'm not sure, Bill, did I answer your question appropriately? If not, please feel free to type in another one, or if others have additional questions.
I have a question while we're waiting, Eric. The age is so, very high.
Yeah.
And what is that? What is typically happens in that transition when somebody passes on? Does the land sold, or does it stay in the family to the children? What would typically happen for these kinds of farms?
It's a good question. I'm not sure that I can. I'm not sure that I have good enough data to answer that. Others may even within the group here. I think we do ask some questions on that. My sense, so I'll note this without a foundation in looking well enough at the literature to be able to say that this is sort of standard or what I would expect across populations. But I think in many cases this has been a real challenge, particularly more recently, where in the past the agricultural land tended to pass down to future generations, and continue to be farmed. I think that's becoming more and more problematic, where that transition is less well defined. I think that there's some concerns about the next generation being interested in farming, and so keeping the land on the property or in the family. I think this has certainly been the case as farm sizes on average have grown. I think we've seen part of that is you've had fewer families engaged in farming. And I know this is a question we have asked here, and it's a question we included in the Australia work too. These questions about successional planning. It seems to be an area of concern, I would say, among many of our participants as well, that they recognize this as a challenge, and they don't necessarily have a well-developed plan yet. I would say on average, some of them seem to, but I think the succession planning is a real challenge for them to work through. So I think it is really, I would completely agree. It's interesting, and when you think about, it's interesting for a lot of measures, but when you think about the likely future turnover, when the median age is as high as it is, for each of these categories, it's pretty amazing to think what the population of rural landowners might look like in 10 years.
Right.
Yeah, I can say within the group within Australia, within these communities, they've found within those counties, I think that they've done some longitudinal work, which is why they're able to say this, and this is something I hope we were able to do in the future here too. But I think they were seeing about half of their property ownership changing hands within a 10-year period, and some of those were staying within the family. but there were a lot of changes, really. It just became increasingly complex, really, over time. Um, yeah, so I think it is a really good question. And I think another point of, an important point to think through, as we're thinking about change within these rural communities, it's not just the change we've been seeing to date, and even the trends we've been seeing to date aren't necessarily going to be the same trends that are driving things for the next 10 to 15 years. So ultimately, I think age is going to be, and has been, but maybe a more important driver moving forward too. Bill, you also asked if I have a written report. We do have a written report. I think we we have a frequency report as well that I can definitely share. That just will go through all of the data and demonstrate the responses we have to date. I think we'll do some more targeted reports on some of these points as well moving forward. So it's something I can certainly share with you as we get those generated. If you want to send me an email, I can make sure to send those out to you and others that are interested as well. I should probably go to the final slide with my email as I keep saying that so that people can track me down. Great. Any other questions or comments that people might want to raise?
Well, maybe this is a good place to stop for today. Thanks again, Eric. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your research. And thanks to all the participants for asking questions and staying with us. Hope everybody has a great afternoon, and we'll see you again at the next webinar.
Great, thank you.
Yep, thanks, Eric.